It's well known that around the turn of the century, scientific innovations were pushing the limits of human creativity. Famous examples include the Wright brothers' first flight and Henry Ford's assembly line. But when viewed from the perspective that I will share with you today, all of those pale in comparison to the invention of Bakelite. Bakelite marked a turning point in how we as humans relate to objects and materials, which in turn impacts how we understand and care for ourselves, each other, and our planet that we share. Leo Hendrik Baekeland was born on November 14th in 1863 in Ghent, Belgium. He excelled in school, so much so in fact that the city of Ghent gave him a scholarship to Ghent University, where he would go in 1880. 4 years later, in 1884, he began filling numerous teaching roles there, including assistant and associate professor, up until about 1889. Shortly after that, he would marry Céline Swartz, and they went on to be a very happy couple up until Baekeland's death in 1944. Aside from inventing Bakelite, he also invented Velux photographic paper in 1892 and founded the Nepera Chemical Company. As for his invention of Bakelite, that story begins in 1899, when Eastman Kodak Co. bought the Nepera Chemical Company and with it Velux. Bakeland made $215,000 out of the transaction, and used some of that money to buy Snug Rock, an estate in Yonkers that would serve as his home and laboratory in the many years to come. Describing his life at the time, Bakeland said, "Thus at 35, I found myself in comfortable financial circumstances, a free man, ready to devote myself again to my favorite studies. Then truly began the very happiest period of my life. I improvised one of the buildings at my residence in Yonkers into a modest but conveniently equipped laboratory. Henceforth, I was able to work at various problems of my own free choice. In this way, I enjoyed for several years that great blessing, the luxury of not being interrupted in one's favorite work." Bakeland became interested in synthetic resins and began to experiment with reactions between phenol and formaldehyde. Other experiments had been done before by Adolf von Baeyer and Werner Kleeberg in 1872 and 1893, respectively. The result of Kleeberg's experiment was a porous, brittle substance that likely would have looked something like the image pictured here. Their sole objectives, however, were to search for synthetic dyes, and thus they both viewed the results of their experiments as useless brittle waste. Eventually, Bakeland invented Novolac, a synthetic replacement for shellac, a useful substance provided by the lac bugs of Southeast Asia. But that was neither a success nor is it very relevant to the topic of this documentary. After the failure provided by Novolac, in the early summer of 1907, Bakeland instead pivoted focus to creating a resin that could laminate and in turn strengthen wood. The result was Bakelite, heated resins of phenol and formaldehyde, the first fully synthetic material the world had ever known. Better known today as plastic, it was heat-resistant, non-conductive, moldable, and durable. And the best part, thanks to the commercialization of the Bakelizer, a device designed by Bakeland to control heat and pressure in order to manufacture Bakelite, it was cheap to make. Later that same year, Bakeland applied for a patent for Bakelite, which he received 2 years later in 1909. He started off by marketing it as an electrical insulator. In 1922, the Bakelite Company was founded. The company's brand new advertising department started an aggressive campaign marketing Bakelite as the material of 1,000 uses. 2 years later, in 1924, Bakeland was on the cover of the Times magazine, and he grew increasingly better known by the public. Bakelite's influence and presence grew similarly, impacting every corner of industry and manufacturing and beyond. It lived up to its slogan with varied and sometimes quite unexpected applications.
After World War I, my dad was interested in finding uses for Bakelite other than the industrial uses for which it had excelled during the war. And being the artist that he was, he thought he'd try out making jewelry and other personal items.
Bakelite's production of jewelry may come as a surprise, especially if you hadn't heard of it before watching this, and assumes that Bakelite was mainly associated with manufacturing and industry. But jewelry was an industry, and quite a lucrative one. Since literally the first known examples of jewelry, humans have had to rely on the natural materials that surround them, and the things that surrounded them weren't always cheap or easy to get. And even if you could get them, They required an astronomical level of skill and usually time as well to turn into jewelry. But then...
Old age is the sole source of man's materials. Our modern complex industrial world has found them insufficient and has turned elsewhere to fulfill its needs. Turned to a fourth kingdom, the kingdom of scientific research, a new domain of man's own creation, a world of primary substances which never existed before. The aristocrats of this new realm are the phenolic plastics, of which Bakelite resinoids are the first family.
Bakelite jewelry had almost the exact same effect as natural materials like ivory or pearl. But Bakelite you don't have to find in nature. Bakelite you can make out of thin air. At the time, it was amazing to have a material that was so cheap, so durable, could be shiny and bright, with such a wide array of colors. It opened up fashion to new styles and new people. People who could never afford fine jewels or gold bracelets could afford a Bakelite bangle. This was a revolution in its own way. Jewelry used to be either reserved for the wealthiest people or used only on sacred occasions. By the 1950s, plastic jewelry had become so widespread and cheap and easy to make that it was literally being sold as children's toys. In the second half of the 20th century, jewelry production exploded, and so did individual expression. People started viewing jewelry as major parts of their identities or personalities. It wasn't just jewelry, either. Bakeland's invention had paved the way for a host of other synthetic materials, and at the same time as Bakelite jewelry was taking off, new synthetic fabrics were gaining hold.
Behold then the maid, chemically garbed, even her jewel-like necklace, from the same substance as her satin-like slipper. Garments seen and unseen from head to toe, a synthetic symphony from DuPont's magic pile of gold.
It wasn't just about the individual, either. Clothes and jewelry could make political statements. It helps people discover their identity, give them a sense of control over who they are, and even help them heal from trauma. There's no fear of failing or getting it wrong.
Style is the first vocabulary that I had to describe who I was on my own terms. I didn't get a choice in the body that I was given, so style was how I self-authored. And that's still what it means to me today. What do I want to say beyond words?
Bakelite jewelry has planted a seed that has grown into a garden with astonishing creative power. Consider that in 1907, when Bakeland was experimenting with the resins that would lead to Bakelite, to get to choose a set of clothes would be a rare treat, the kind of thing you might get as a wedding gift. Today, many people go shopping as a pastime. In other words, consume for fun. We now know that the flip side of this awesome creative power is immensely destructive. Our planet is melting under the burden of excess. It can't be either or. Freedom, peace, personal empowerment, or the planet. Some scholars think that Bakeland succeeded because he didn't limit himself to solving one problem from one angle. Whereas scientists like Bayer and Kleberg looked at their experiments and only saw a lack of synthetic dye, Bakeland saw his from many angles, which allowed him to see possibilities beyond the failed experiment, and instead create a material of 1,000 uses. If the age of plastics is any example, then that means that humans are super powerful, if supernatural. We can create and destroy nature on an extraordinary scale, and we can think about more than one problem at a time.